thank you all for still being here and being brave enough to sit outside. We reckon we're right for a while. And we did say as part of the afternoon we try and have a slightly more in-depth conversation. We have a panel and we have a bigger panel, so it's hopefully quite interactive. One person who has been very much part of the deeper evolutionary thinking for an evolutionarily long time, who has turned up after Gary Muir from Walpole Wilderness. You've met Carol, you've met Ben, Steve Hopper, who, if there's anyone here who doesn't know him, be ashamed, and Peter Luscombe. And we just need to form up the conversation, and then it's all got to come from you, and what do you want to know, what do you want to explore, and so on. We did, I don't know if we ever showed you a run sheet for these, but we suggest you could open the panel with a bit of, what are we talking about when we say each time evolution, plant richness, biodiversity, all those big words.
Thanks, Steve.
We're dropping you in it.
I just wanted to say two things while I briefly got the floor. I had really interesting discussions with Ben in 2017, as many people did, when the initial exploration was going on. And it was fantastic to see the outcome. And like all things Noongar, I guess, Carol, they just take their own time. You want me to tell him? So,
Speak up!
sorry. I'll have to, want me to start again?
Yes. Move forward!
Anyway, great to see it wasn't on time or it wasn't on budget. It really is a credit to everyone involved. And my personal take on it, first impressions, was that it celebrates one of the great insights that the Southern Hemisphere is offering the Northern Hemisphere in terms of evolution. So going right back to Darwin and before him, we all have learnt, I'm sure, or heard about evolutionary trees. So everyone's looking for a single trunk with lots of branches, and the shape of the structure, to me, is an evolutionary wile. It's the Noongar word. If you're a Victorian, mallee. So it's the mallee of life or the wile of life, if you want to use a Noongar word for the same thing. An underground structure with multiple stems coming up. The more we look at evolution, the more it looks like many organisms follow that structure, not a straight tree with branches. So, congratulations, Ben. I think that your coffee table was trying to tell you Southern Hemisphere evolution goes this way, and you did it beautifully. So I think that's great. And I just love the combination of Aboriginal and Western science, the mixture of the two. And the songlines are yarning. It's going to evolve, I think. I'd really enjoy coming back in a few years and listening to someone interpret the structure, because I'm sure all of us will take different things from it. That's all I wanted to say, Keith. Is that all right?
That's pretty good. I might ping you again later. But there we go. But Gary, we haven't heard from you, and there you go.
It's such a special place to celebrate, with a place of to celebrate really biodiversity, and always have been one of the most important parts is to have your totems, to have your icons. It was. And what I really love, you've come to such a place where of such uniqueness and such interlocking, such diverse ecosystems with just such species richness that is also quite famous for the southwest of Western Australia. But what you're also on is, in reality, these reserves are such a very small part. It's a petite protected portion of our planet, but you've just got to, in reality, see what's around there. And I think what I love about Twin Creeks is just its culture, expanding that biodiversity, and this is the future message that we always want, and to express also at Steve. It really is a tangled tree down below, and I agree. The sculpture that certainly remembers that. What's also important, the science has to always be a part of it, and some of the very first scientists of methodical observation and analysis. Our families come here 8 generations, and we had a very special relationship with the Noongar people from the southwest, and they were the true scientists, methodically observing, analysing, having hypotheses, and worked out over so long, and then to make them into stories, to make them into your totems, because something happened and we developed this amazing ability of storytelling. And if you want to move on to understand that you get the communication, cooperation, and culture together, you learn what you want, your messages, and you get that through stories, having your heroes, having your totems. And Twin Creeks, it was such a special part to put science and culture together with the project. So thank you. I know.
Passion, that's cool.
Yeah, and it really has. It's been a 4,000 billion year journey from the ocean depths, from such simpler beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been evolved and are being evolved, and to go through to that deep history, and it's still changing, and it's science, as always, is a progress report, as with our culture. And for us to have a thriving biosphere is to have a thriving biodiversity, and this is the month for the International Day of Biodiversity. Happened last weekend, so it's great to be 1 week later than that we can actually celebrate that for what will bring us to the future. And Twin Creeks is one of the world examples of showing about the rewilding of what can happen. So I'm very proud to be sitting here with young Carol and with a team that's so dedicated to be able to bring forward an understanding and awareness of our world and our role within it through science and culture. Thank you.
Someone in the bigger panel want to respond to that? How does that make you feel?
Can I ask you to try and strip back time even further before the fauna and flora of this area? What were the Coronga like 1 billion years ago? How high were they? You have an understanding of the geology of this area to know what has happened in 1 billion years. I mean, the Sterlings, as you know, are Johnny come lately, so he's very fresh. But these are very ancient, as you're well aware. Do you understand the geology of this particular area well enough to give us an idea what those raindrops would have looked like 1 billion years ago?
Like nothing else on the planet today, I think, Kingsley, is the best way to respond. I don't know the exact height, but 1 billion years of erosion, even if it's been at the slow pace of the last 250 million years of about 1 metre a year, do your math. Someone do their math. Come up with.
I reckon it was at least the size of the Alps, because all you're seeing is the root of the mountain that was never exposed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. They're part of the Albany Fraser origin, which was formed when Antarctica was rammed up with Antarctica. And the Antarctic mountains give you a little bit of a sense of slightly higher stuff, but they would have been 10 times, I don't know, maybe 50 times higher than they are now. They are the stub, and just extraordinary persistence. And I think the beauty of this place, what we've learnt from the flora is we've gone right and it's been reinforced from the first analysis that if you want to go to the richest places for plants, you don't go to the tops of the Sterlings or the Warringora, you come here. It's actually the intervening country between Sterlings and Fitz, and that sort of arcs around into this area as well. And it's really just these slightly elevated bumps in the landscape that are equally as valuable as the summits of the two peaks in terms of diversity, biological diversity. I'm not telling you guys, I'm telling you guys to suck in, I'm sure, because this bloke's buying land and doing it, trying to repair and restore this stuff. Huge challenge. We barely know how to do it. So it's a great place for learning that, and for understanding that every little bump in the landscape, the big mountains catch your attention first. Every little bump in this landscape is invaluable, and many of you are farmers who've got such bumps, they're cause for celebration because they're like nothing else in the rest of Australia, dare I say. There's a few places on other continents that are similar. And as you say, the Stirling Range, I mean, they're older rocks, they're 2.1 billion, I think. Corongrup's 1.1 billion, roughly. But as a landform, the Stirling Range is just the last flip when Gondwana was ripping apart, about 100 million years old. So they're a relatively young, rugged mountain range. Corongurup is ancient, weathered, rounded, and a place to be deeply respected.
If I can add to that as a tectonist, if you want to call it, one of the first things that happens before a mountain range is built, you build a deep geosyncline, which is why you get limestones and that in the Alps. You would have had them on the Corongurup, and that would have been below sea level because it has a geosynclinal basin. And then due to isostatic readjustment and that, because it's so light, it gets forced up with the granites pushing up. And that forms your mountain belts as well. It's part of the tectonic cycle. Yes. So the Corongurup would have had limestones on it, it would have had sandstones, siltstones, all deposited deep in the ocean before it was lifted up. And like in the top of the Alps, you get limestones which were deposited below sea level.
Okay. So are there any scraps of limestone?
No, we have found an inclusion of the host rock in, nobody knows about it, near the potato patch. We should do a job about that.
Oh, really? Yeah, to have a look.
On that point, because for this bigger heartland journey, we've been trying to write up the grand narrative of this region.
They talk to Luke.
Oh yeah, we have been, and we've written it up 3 or 4 times so far, I think, Luce, and I think the Friends could do well. They have a special little session out here with Steve, Luce, Katie Evans from the, Professor of Geology at Curtin, who lives at Torbay, and apparently her mate, Catherine McArcy, I think, is living at Denmark now. We've got
Spagiari, I think it is.
that's the
And
one.
her husband, they're two geologists now living in Denmark who are deeply interested in granite landscapes.
And Katie has sat me down recently and boxed me ears and said, "Nah, that's not right." So, without further ado, what does the owner of a little bump out here feel? You know, is this how it's played out for you?
Fascinated for 300 years old. I'd be fascinated every day because when you get out and about, you can walk 100 metres, you can go beach sand, laterite, deep granite loams, granite rocks, and back. Every 100 metres in some areas you'll get that complete change, but it's not only the soil that changes, the geology, the plants change. It's like that. And that's what makes this area so interesting. And I'm not just talking beach sand, beach looking sand, there's some things missing. Clay flats, totally different vegetation again in the riparian zone. You've got clay on top of hills, different again. You've got the pilnut siltstones, which are the coloured layered silt areas, which are completely different flora once again. You know, you might get a little bit of an overlap, but quite often it completely changes. I'm talking about one property, you know, and that doesn't cover all of them. We've got areas where we got what's that iron ore locally? Magnetite. We've got area of magnetite, and that looks like a stone that's come from out there somewhere.
We've got that Pilbara region right up there.
That's right. What we call down there, in the summer we call it the Pilbara, in the winter we call it the Everglades. It's big chunks of what they mine up in the Pilbara. That's what it looks like, and the soil is red. It's just so red. And this is on a very small area, and this sort of explains some of the biodiversity, the plant biodiversity, the animal biodiversity, but then that's just the geology. Then we've got the climatic changes. We've got the rainfall dropping off like that from the Corongurups to get to here, and even further when you get to our place. So your rainfall, drops down about 50% in 10 kilometres. So, and then you've got the inflows of the Jarrah and the southwest wetland forest coming and stopping just halfway down Knife Road here. We've got Parry's an outlier carry forest following a freshwater stream out of the Prongrupps, stops at Knife Road, basically. And then another half a kilometre, you've got Wandoos and Mallee country. You start on the inland stuff. That's quite unusual. You've got she oak, granite she oaks from Kell coming back this way, stops pretty well here. On the granites, on our granite ridge there, it's the inland rock she oak. From the south end of King Creeks, you've got the coastal she oak. And it's a cut-off.
Sorry, are you trying to tell me it's not all just bush?
And you're the head at
No, just the tail.
Sorry.
No, but how many times have we had that response from visitors? And that's what I think that's part of what we're all trying to do. No, it's not just bush. It's this incredible thing, which is
And that's just skimming the surface.
no one's jumping to arc, so I'm going to arc Ben. I mean,
There's a question here.
oh, sorry.
There might be a peanut gallery.
So that's the latter scientific view of everything. So I'm wondering if we could have the same thing, but from the view of the first scientist, the Noongar culture, the history of the land and what happened from those people that experienced it and passed it on.
What's the long view, Carol?
I didn't hear the question.
I'll paraphrase. Tell me when I get it wrong. What's the Noongar perspective on these stories of geology and Western science and how rocks come up and down and bend and then
Well,
all these different bits of bush happen?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Noongar science is so simple. It is so simple because the landscape, we never interrogated nature. We never examined it. We never challenged it. We lived with nature. So we didn't interrogate it at all. We lived with it. And whatever the plants deemed, we flowed with that. So the seasons, we flowed with the seasons and all of that. However, our stories, some of our stories go back, I'd say Jurassic time, because they were about megafauna. Some of our Dreamtime stories about megafauna. Our stories about the movement of the stars. You know, that was a long, long time ago. Which those stories are different to our songline stories. And a lot of our stories also about the creation of the land. We have stories about how the Stirling Ranges were created. And if somebody says they're billions of years old, so how long have our people been here to be able to tell those stories as well? We have stories about the plants, and part of that, to be able to look after, the only science we had was the totemic system. We all couldn't look after the land. We had to have separate tasks to be able to do it. And so that's where our totemic system comes in. This is where our boundaries of, which is where's our country, all of that, and that's deemed by our totem system. So I just think Noongar science is so simple, so simple. And it reminds me of Richard Walley. Dr. Richard Walley said, you know what the difference between a Noongar science and a regular science? Well, a Noongar scientist, he will hear that frog over there croaking, and he'll say, yep, everything's going well. Regular science will grab it, put it on the table, pin it down, split it open, and the frog don't work no more. Yeah. Hopefully.
Both ways they croak.
No, I mean, yeah, we do have our science, but I think, from my perspective, it's so simple. We don't analyse, we accept what it is we're being told by nature, and we flow with it. We never interrogate it, we don't, and the stories are handed down verbatim. We cannot divert from those stories to make sure it stays pure and true.
All right, so we've had a good dose of Western science. Thank you for that question. It goes to the original science. There's a bloody artist in the middle. What have you made of all that? What have you made of all that?
Well, I think that we need tools that are saturated within our culture that facilitate an understanding not only of deep time, but our place within this archetype we call the tree of life. But if you think about extinction, we hear about extinction 6, but what does it actually look like? These are the things that I think about often. It doesn't look like the others. I've modelled it. You look at the human biomass, and there's the bubonic plague and massive population. And within that, you stand on that and you look at, and you can see so many other species in decline. But then there's our companion species, the other species that we've domesticated. Again, massive populations of these creatures. The domesticated animals and, of course, the ferals as well. And then where do we sit in relation to that? Linnaeus said that we all have an address within the tree of life, but how do we make that visible and functional? And then how do we use it? Because if we can understand how we're part of a system, then we're more likely to take an interest in it and protect it. And as I was saying before, keep the gene streams flowing through space and through time. And that's what I love about this. I love seeing projects like this. I've had an opportunity to do many artist residencies around Australia, learn from the traditional owners, learn from the conservationists and scientists. And I remember Ken Johnson, I was with him out at Alice Springs Desert Park, and he said, it's starting again. We were looking at the sunset. I said, what's starting again? The killing, the cats, you know, and things like that you don't forget. So to build the tools to facilitate communities in understanding natural systems and being part of that, and being part of the restoration, as Keith was talking about, cultural and ecological restoration. We need cultural restoration for the entire planet. The way that we interact with nature, not as a separate thing, but as part of that within this growing oneness of these gene streams of which we are part one. And I believe that if we work towards that through public artworks, if we work with communities that have this purpose-centered existence based on this connectivity of the natural world, we have a chance, you know, to live in harmony and live with an awareness of natural systems. That's what I'd like to see. Through visual literacy, it's possible for us to do that. We just need the tools out there, online learning, teaching, where communities are given a voice to work towards ecological restoration. Nathan McCoy said to me once, it's about connectivity in your part of the planet. But if we're all doing that, it's a very special thing. But the tools aren't there. Not enough of the tools are out there where we can integrate, say, this social networking stuff, this Facebooky, Twitter stuff and all that, and embed it all into this one system where it's all working together with this sense of cultural awareness and identity that is based within the tree of life. One life growing through space and time. Not as space-time, but as biospace-time. That's what I'd like to see. And that's what this has all been about. For me, working with the traditional owners, working with the conservation organisations and the scientists, so that this is not separate bits and pieces of knowledge, but it's a connected awareness. So that's what this gene stream sculpture is about. And that's what drives me.
Great phrase, a connected awareness. I like it. Hey,
So on the panel, where do you see social media and citizen science in the scheme of education and awareness for the restoration of our planet or of plant life and animals recovery? Do you see that as a positive step?
I think what Ben was saying, it's to get that connectedness, to have an understanding as well. It's about lowering those boundaries, and it is a mode of lowering those boundaries to really get that culture and nature together for the future. So, and it's nothing's right or wrong, only thinking can make it so. But it can be a tool in exactly what Ben was saying, and being able to lower those boundaries and bring it together. That if we're to work on this world, and as Ben was with the biomass, you know, so if that's all the animals, we're the fists now, and that's our domesticated animals, and the wild section we've got left is on the end of our finger. For us to have that understanding of the world is having ability to share it and working together. as storytelling, but making sure you're making your opinions and your knowledge on methodical observation and analysis and through science. So you bring that together, so it can be a positive medium for that. Of course, it's merely needed.
Can be.
Indeed.
Can be.
What helps it be?
What helps it be? I don't know the answer. Social media gives far too many. I really don't know what the answer is, because I've seen it on Facebook on various sites like nature site, wildflower site, and other sites where people the majority can have an opinion which totally goes against nature. And people who, and I've seen people, I've been one of them, where you get basically swamped by negative responses because you're trying to do the right thing for the planet. But the knowledge is not out there, and I'm just not sure how you get the knowledge out there. And you'll get one or two, I reckon it's around about the 5% rule, where people, general public I'm talking about, understand what you're talking about. But you've got the masses, and it's a bit like the voting system. You can get some pretty strange people in power, but I just don't know how you get through to the masses on that one. And once you've been fired at a few times, you tend to stand back.
Well, I think this is a good one to explore. I'm just going to throw in an observation of mine. A couple of years ago, we did a paper with a reasonably distinguished professor of ecology, and he said, can we put in a bit about citizen science? And I said, yeah, sure. And can I put in a bit about academic science? And let bloom. And I think part of what we've done that I don't fully understand is that we have broken observations of reality, daily recording what's actually happened. We've partitioned it off somehow. Look, I'm not meant to talk much, but anyone who hasn't read the biography of Alexander Humboldt is really should. It's a great book, and the thing that impressed me, he wandered off around the world, and he, came up with catenary sequences and all this botanically exciting stuff. And then he went back and sat down with these other scientists in Germany, like Goethe, the philosophers and so on. They saw themselves as an integrator. And I think we've broken things up a bit. But Peter hasn't got any answers. Has anyone else?
Yeah.
Someone give the audience.
Yeah, I think I got the answer.
Oh, good. Yeah, we know that about you, Jerry.
49. No, apart from 49 or whatever that one is. 42. Sorry, I got that one wrong.
Wrong answer.
The big problem we're facing here is the difference between factual and interpretation. And we seem to think that interpretation is sometimes a fact.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we differ a lot. And that's why we get these differences of opinion and people criticising people, because if you can actually separate what is actually factual from what is being interpreted, you wouldn't have half the problems we've got now.
I sort of agree with you. My answer is that
Your
advice to people is you believe nothing you hear and only half what you see.
Well,
You stay pretty safe.
that's how come I've got this stuff.
Jane.
I'd like to say, coming over here, we listened to new scientists, the science show, and it was all on interactiveness, and we're all in boxes, and we've got to get out of boxes and be interactive with every different system that is. And I can't say all the words they did, it was very good.
We have a son-in-law who's Greek. So a fundamental truth is the Greeks invented everything. But they did invent two things, democracy and Western science as we know. And I find understanding the politics of the enabler of that efflorescence was that at the time Greece was in city-states, there was no single king, and preachers were regarded as people not much above the frogs you were talking about.
Are you pointing to me?
Only the frogs you're talking about. So, I mean, it was a time when there wasn't centralised power, is my understanding, and that 300-year period led to some remarkable steps forward. But most of Earth's history is the other non-300 years, where there's a natural progression towards power, and then power has a bit of trouble with fundamental truths or anything that challenges it. So, you know, social media is just, if you like, another form of power as far as I'm concerned. Used in the right way, I think it's a really powerful investigative tool, but equally it can be abused and you end up being in a worse situation than when you didn't have it. So it may not be the answer to your question. Citizen science is fantastic, and as long as it's coupled with science. So it's the partnerships, I think, and it's the same with Noongar stuff. You know, I really think the way forward is for us to work together as this piece of artwork demonstrates, and share stories, share insights and yarns, and hopefully something better will come out of the amalgamation.
I've been waiting for this opportunity, so thank you, Steve. How I got involved in this is, I met Ben when he first came over, and then the second time, and by that time we'd cemented a friendship and trust with each other. And I remember talking to Ben, so the Twin Creek concept of having something iconic was already here, the land was here, Gone Wanderlink was, but I think there's some consternation about who, what and how. I think that was on the drawing board.
Always is.
Yeah. And I just, that day I had a downer day, and I had my cup of tea in my hand and we were talking to Ben. And I was, I suppose, going through a grief process of rejection and non-recognition, because I just finished hearing Prime Minister of Australia setting aside billions of dollars to reenact Captain Cook's journey around Australia. And as I said, I was going through a grief process of cultural loss and non-recognition of why didn't he honour our First Peoples footprints? What I was thinking, because we created all the highways and the walk trails and all of that. And Ben kept prompting me, you know, how, what, where, who, this kind of a thing. And we talked about these reference points. And then Ben said, yeah, Twin Creeks has got this sculpture idea or something. And that sort of conversation went on from there. But for me, the whole thing has been humbling in that, oh gosh, I might start crying in a minute. Ben listened to me. He heard my pain. He felt my pain, the cultural grief that I was going through, and he kept prompting me. And he was honouring my story. He was listening to me, and honestly, you got no idea the feeling of power that I got from that. So, my dear friend, it was just he honoured my story. He was listening to the pain of what we were going through. Because I've had a man in higher position, when I was telling a story and I wanted to protect a sacred site, he folded his arms and he just said, I think all this is foolishness. And that devastated me. And this was a man that was in a position to do something. But Ben was listening to what I was saying, and I said the whole thing has just been humbling because I felt valued. Our stories were being valued, and he was prepared to honour that. So, my dear friend, thank you.
So going on from that, Carol, that's just beautiful what you've just said. How do us Wadulers, how do we do it better? How do we listen better to what your people have to say?
Cup of tea in a tea bag. It's magic formula. Sit down and have it. Just listen.
Just talk about it.
Yeah. This is the magic formula.
There is actually a paper out of the Kimberley on Kapati ecology, And I had trouble working out what the page was on about until I realised that Kapati, cup of tea.
Yeah. Sometimes a bottle of wine, a glass of wine.
Yeah, well,
My question is following on a little bit from that. It's when I did a meet and greet down the bottom of Castle Rock. There was a wonderful opportunity of the people going up there. I have not had one person come down that hasn't felt, hasn't been involved in. And this is without them, they're starting from their own being, walking up the rock, coming down, and in a spot of having felt something quite different, quite special. And it's just, how do we get from there, when they're in that space, to get them to think about the story behind it and to shift them off into the interest in the science and extending what they felt into some intellectual knowledge.
If I can put a little bit of a story in on that, Keith arrived back into Albany the other night with a lady by the name of Juliet Albany. And Juliet's a pretty passionate sort of lady when it comes to her belief in some things. And one of the things that she's really passionate about right now is getting kids involved, in getting kids out of doors, in getting them to meet First Nations people, into incorporating color with nature, with getting away from the screens. And I think that was part of the reason we created Twin Creeks as well, was to get school kids to come out and get dirt in their hands, to one of you said it, to recognize that there is something special in their own backyard. There's something special over there underneath that black boy, whether it's a snail or a lizard, and that's what we have to do. I think
It's the feeling that you can see that individual have in a space like this.
this is the opportunity space for them to be able to do that. Yeah. So Juliet's pretty passionate right now about trying to get young kids, school age, maybe not the real young ones, but maybe second or third graders out, so the age where they'll appreciate things a bit more than having to just be babysat while they're out here. But that's one of the ideas that we've always wanted to have. Yes, you in the back.
He's the adjudicator, that's not good.
I don't do much of a job of it with you there.
No,
You wanted to respond before I responded.
with a lot of these questions coming around, not driven by economics, and the sooner we can get down to a sustainable growth rather than an economical growth, we'll be in a happier situation.
Indeed, but I think the conversation here to some extent is about how we do it.
How we do it, that's the million-dollar
It's
question.
definitely through the kids. You've got to get the kids, because then they grow up knowing it. And once they know it, they bring it with them. If you don't get them early enough, you've lost it, because they've gone over to becoming consumers. And once they're consumers, that's the end of it.
When I was at Uluru, I was doing a residency there, and there was a teachers' conference, and so I had the exhibition up, and a teacher came in and said, "Oh, this is a wonderful visual literacy tool," and I'd never heard the term before. And I thought, well, visual literacy that leaves a legacy, and how would you connect that with education so that the students, the school kids, were involved in something where they were learning, but they were also participating, but then there was something online. And so I went with the astronomer that I was working with to the local school, and we introduced the kids to this idea that these rocks in Central Australia were a certain age, and that keyed us in to an ancient ecosystem of Cambrian times, and then that keyed us into the story of the stars, these points of light, and how long have these photons been travelling for, and could they connect all these stories together? So we introduced all this material to them. They did all of these drawings, and we scanned all the drawings. We put them into a big interactive artwork, and we linked it all up with these short films. So each one of the kids' drawings was keyed into a story. We put it all on one of the websites I run, which is sciart.com.au, which is there's a SciArt for Schools section there. So those kids were then able to go back to that and see their drawings and then watch the relatable films. And so there's a legacy element attached to that learning, so it's not just something that happens in a classroom. I think that model worked. It was one of those roundabout things which wasn't intended that way, but it came out that way. And I've also worked in Africa with another school. There's only 2 projects, but I'd love to see more where there's a visual literacy element component connected with a legacy component online, and to see more integration with citizen science as a template that could work for a lot of schools. That's the kind of thing that gets kids potentially, I hope, coming back to an experience of environment where they learn things, and then maybe over time they didn't get it, all of it. Like, crikey, I hardly get 1% of what I learn on residencies. But it's there, and then I can come back to it and sort of fill in some more gaps and some more and some more. So over time, the picture kind of broadens. And I have heard from some of those kids, you know, saying, I didn't understand all that then, but I remember you and what that was about, and I watched the films again and again and again, and now I want to do this. That kind of thing, I think, is important in facilitating that kind of thing. Not a chaplaincy program or something like that, but something that gets kids out to the environment where they're learning about the natural systems and what's in their backyard, and that connectivity. Again, cultural and ecological connectivity working together through the younger generation.
I've got a question for Gary following from that, but first Steve's going to...
I'll be brief, Keith.
You don't have to.
It seems to me
There's plenty of wine.
that we could look to the people who've lived here for thousands of years and how they developed the ability to withstand all sorts of change and over generations after generations beyond anything we've experienced. And, you know, there's a few fundamental precepts. One is local. You come from a place, that's your country. And it's fundamentally attached. You're part of it. If I'm speaking out of turn, Carol, just let's have a yarn about it. But this is a first take. So if you want to live in a world of global economy and behave as a global citizen, the best thing you can do is know a place really well. And then education of kids is part of the story, but the Noongar's life is a continuing learning journey where you increasingly get a more sophisticated understanding the older you are. So there's no bleeding point in teaching kids if the adults haven't made fundamental changes in their approach towards learning. Is the one insight I would suggest. And that cup of tea is one of the most powerful ways to start that journey. And it really does call for rethinking some of the fundamentals. Prongraps is an example. People coming back, feeling something about it. All of us do, I think, in a childlike way. It's quite a different level of sophistication to understand that you shouldn't have gone up there in the first place. That's only for very special men and women of high degree in Aboriginal society. You know, when we have a broad community understanding at that level, and Uluru is teaching us that, I think, in Australia. You know, that it's been a real tough battle. That for me as a young fellow, you know, a hill was to climb. You know, you always go to the top and take in the view, and then what do? You come down and you go climb another hill, not understanding what you're doing or why. So I think life is incredibly enriched by sitting down with our Noongar colleagues and trying to develop a cross-cultural understanding.
Sometimes it takes more than one cup of tea.
Absolutely.
While we're talking about youth and youth connecting to country, we do have an emerging leader Do you want to say anything about it? About how you connect to country?
All right, but the opening's there. I wanted to, that question of how you help people see what's there and understand it and have their eyes wider open. I'm a bit impatient with just doing it with schools because I think this decade is the crisis decade. Biologically, ecologically, if you like, and in terms of climate change. And I know, a lot of what happens at Twin Creeks is reaching into adults and helping people understand more. And that's why we've come up with this Heartland Journeys concept, which, because of a few things, is focused on the inland Great Southern for starters, but we have other plans. Gary, you do this every day. You take adults out. Some people call it tourism. I reckon it's a great adult education opportunity. How does that work? What's the potential there? What do you see change with people?
You remember there was that wiring that made us storytellers, and it's probably our most important tool that we have. And we all have our stories. There's many interpretations. One of the great things about the Ionian scientists that Steve was alluding to, they had the ability to mix. It wasn't just dominated, this is the one, and that becomes the dogma of the time. If we have the ability to see where we've come from and the way we go and how we've had our stories, if you want to go forward, even science itself has always been a progress report. You never think that this is the way it is. It's always about change and moving forward, and that ability is there for our stories will also change and have an understanding of the world, how people are. What happened to have so many generations of the Noongar people, there's that sustainability that was in it. It's just what Gazza was saying about tipping the triple bottom line upside down. We're meant to be, if it was when we were kids, it was sustaining environmental, social and economic values, but we're living in a economic enhancement by pretending to sustain our environmental and social values. If you tip that upside down, it's through storytelling and understanding to get people to think again. And that ability will always move forward, and that's the way we'll do it. And my role is here to try and provide that understanding, awareness of our world and people's role within it. Remembering nothing else is right or wrong. You think about what your objective is, trying to achieve for your future. If we want to sustain ourselves, it's about to having a thriving biodiversity, so you have the sustainability of those interlocking ecosystems that will keep thriving. Like you said, we are still part of that tangled web. We're a very dominant one there, but to see that future is to open the eyes so people look at how to rediscover. Discovery is looking at exactly the same thing but seeing something different, and that's what stories can do. And recognising we all have those stories, putting them together globally. Social media can have different ways of coming into those stories, but recognise, see the innocence, why people are thinking how they're thinking, what's trying to achieve. And by that working together, we have to be able to do that. I mean, we have got lots of footprints stamping across the wilds, and those future generations are certainly a very, very important part to be able to bring that big picture in there. So get them the understanding where we've come from a cultural sense and a natural sense, and that'll be our way to the future.
Way to the future. A preferred future, as Peter Elliott says.
Indeed. Now, Kingsley.
Again, this is a beautiful architecturally fine piece of work, engineering wise. A great example of cooperation.
You postulate this may be done multiple times in this area. Is the artistic, like the spark of originality, going to be sufficient to sustain works of that calibre multiple times?
Sure it is. No doubt. No doubt. I mean, each area has its own suite of species. The species will be different. The deep time story will be different. The song lines, the connections to country are different in every location. What we've done here is create a foundation kind of template where you can embed the stories but also connect it to the online learning and teaching, which is important. And what none of you know yet is that I was up till 5 in the morning finishing the genestreams.online website. So if you go to genestreams.online, go to Genestream Sculptures, go to Sculpture Locations, Twin Creeks. Within that you'll see all of the films about this sculpture, but every location will have its own suite of stories that are relatable to their own place.
And I want to give that a bit of a plug, but there's something I want to point out about what the panel is well aware of and knows probably better than the rest of you. You see, I faced them that way and you that way, and they can see how black those clouds are getting. Yeah. So, a couple of quick comments. I think we better wrap. My two quick comments is Ben has all of this on his phone, and
you all do too.
And he's not going to run away just yet. So anyone who wants to dive through his website with him, and just a plug for us, it's there. Is that just we've got to be positive about it, and even though Australia, I think, has slipped behind in the running on working for a better world, we have now entered the United Nations decade of ecosystem restoration. This isn't about stopping further damage. It's about repairing the old, getting us to a better world. The decade gets officially launched on June the 5th in Pakistan. Pakistan, which has its Trillion Trees program. The Africans will be there. They've got their AFR 100, which is their 100-hectare restoration program. La-di-la-di-la. And the fact that globally there is so much positive action starting to happen, I think should lift us all. It's a long weekend in Australia, so we're not doing nothing. I know long weekends are sacrosanct, but if anyone hasn't seen it in their email, and it's got out a bit late, but we are doing a webinar with Eastern Australia and New Zealand on 9 AM June the 3rd, the Thursday, and we've got Pim Christopherson, who heads the UN program. He's not actually speaking, it's 3 AM in Europe, but he'll be there as well. So, with a recording. So, I think we've got to be, there's no option but to be positive. I mean, keep going, keep being positive.
Keith?
Or,
Keith?
or anyone?
Keith?
The rain's coming and the Eagles are about to play.
Oh, I thought there was a...
Keith? He wants to say something.
Do you want
Right.
to say something?
The future.
Future?
He was putting his hand up.
Yeah. Cool, like the art thing we did over at the thing over there. It would be good, like if some kids could come along, like for like tour fun, and like so they can get like some Aboriginal kids and Wadler kids. They don't know the generation and all that. Like I don't even know it, but that's why Nan pushed me along to come because she said it would be good for me. So I came and it's good for me, and I'm like, some kids like want to walk around and some kids stay in the house and do that stuff. Like I have a friend down the road from my house, and we normally go, cause we have a reserve down our road. So we normally go through down there and walk through the bushes, just like looking at like little huts people made with trees and all that, and walk through there, follow kangaroo pads and all that.
I take that as an invitation. You're leading it because you've already been here and know it.
Yeah, you can see we're not going to survive much longer.
We're going to wrap up.
I'm glad I'm younger than you, Gary.
Quickly Jane, and then quickly here, and then the Eagles are playing apparently.
Oh, let's keep talking.
When you were talking, I thought with one of your next months upside down, could you have underneath, below the surface instead of above the surface? So you have one above and below, so you'll have to choose the land.
Design?
Oh, don't suggest that to me, I'll have him excavating underneath there so we can see below it.
One last comment and the rain.
I'd just like to say I'm impressed with my youngest grandchild. My other one's a bit too old for me. But her change in value attitude is vastly different from mine and what I was when I was her age. And I'm sure a lot of them are like her and they're open to not new values, but different values from any place. If you know what I mean. It's just a sense I've had with some of the things that she acknowledges and says and sort of says, surprise and that sort of thing. She's just got that different approach to people and who they are and where they come from. And I think we've got a lot of hope. If there's many, but she's only 13, so there's many in that group that we're probably not understanding or valuing as much as we know.
Well, we can do better, but we can say with certainty as a closing comment that all of you here today have helped pave the way to make it easier for your 13-year-old grandchild and lots of other kids coming along. I'll just wrap. Thank you all for coming.
Free Jocos! Free